that's the purpose of this series. I'm particularly interested in this one because we have one of our 3 missions at Nesta is about trying to halve obesity. And we actually feel very optimistic about the potential to halve obesity. My starting point is just to go back to the maths. When you look at how you would halve obesity, it would take roughly a 215 calorie reduction on a daily basis for people with excess weight. Now that sounds perhaps surprisingly small. 215 calories is about 8.5% of people's daily intake. It's about a packet of McCoy's crisps or a packet of, a small bottle of Coke. But our approach to trying to do that is not to try and encourage personal abstinence and willpower. It's to try to take out those 215 calories through lots and lots of small changes, whether in the recipes or in people's choices, in what's promoted, and do that without relying on individual willpower. And it's about changing the food environment, which is very much the subject of today. And we feel confident if you did do that across people's shopping baskets, across people's purchases in restaurants or coffee shops, you could do this almost without people noticing, which is, I think, our aim and why we think it's sustainable. The key is collective action and not relying on voluntary action amongst lots of organisations. So we're looking at the role of regulation or taxation, as well as sort of all the kind of great voluntary activities that already happen today. So that's a little bit about the mission that we have at Nesta. We're doing sort of roughly 3 things in that mission. One is working with partners on the ground, the likes of Asda or Deliveroo or Starbucks, to trial examples of shifting food behaviour. We're then trying to build ventures, build companies that try and do this, and then doing a lot of work on the policy side and analysis. So with that in mind, I want to now introduce the panel. And we're very excited to hear from Professor Yap Seidell, who is going to provide the context from Amsterdam and what was tried there. That was launched in 2012. So we're going to hear from Yap initially, and then we're going to be having a panel discussion with Nikita Sinclair, who's going to talk about the lessons from the UK in London from 2018 and how this was applied here, and also from Dennis Overton, who's going to join us online, who's going to give his perspective on what they've been doing in Scotland, particularly with the Good Food Nations Bill. So that's the rough format. Then we'll have some time for some Q&A and participation from both you here, but also you online. And we're actually going to run slightly over than we thought. We're going to go to 10:45. If you do need to sneak out before, they're absolutely fine, but we are going to run on until 10:45. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Yap.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me over from Amsterdam. Just to tell you, we still have a problem of overweight and obesity in Amsterdam, just to manage expectations. But I will tell you a little bit about the journey that we have undertaken, and that is actually much further away than 2012. I think I started discussing it with the local municipality in 2004 or something like that. So you have to have some perseverance, and I think the main messages that I will convey is that you have to have perseverance, you have to have patience, you have to manage expectations, and you have to manage networks. That is basically what's happening here. We have not a bad starting point. I can't point at one slide if there are 2, but on the far left you see the Netherlands. So it has, in the OECD countries, the lowest prevalence of overweight and obesity, which is not a bad start to do. But still we have large inequalities, and you see almost halfway is the UK. And but the idea about healthy weight was especially arising around 2010 or something like that, when people agreed that healthy living was a problem in the health disparities were increasing. Overweight and obesity were increasing, and they were taking a toll on the mental and physical health of children. And this is now part of a national program, so this is the scaling, in which we have signed up around 200 municipalities, 220, I think it's now more. And I'm not going to get into the details, but it is important that scaling is that you organize municipalities. They learn from each other, they inspire each other, they visit each other, and they all have similar problem. So that JOG program is around 1.7 million children involving at the moment. What is important of this has been evaluated on a national basis, and I will tell you a few things about it that are important. There are bit messy slides because there's lots of text on it, but this is a publication where we had a national evaluation of this JOG program. So they compared neighborhoods and towns where they had this approach and followed it over time, compared to neighborhoods and towns where they did not have it, and matched it for results. And I think what is important is that you do see a reduction in the prevalence of overweight and obesity. This was the first time we actually saw that. More importantly, the long-term effects were actually found in those who were engaged longer, as you can imagine. And I'll tell you a little bit about this. This is the difference in overweight and obesity. So the blue ones are the controls. So it is not randomized, but this is how you compare it. And then you have the neighborhoods that are in red that have this approach. And I have to tell you also, political turnover is around 1 in 4 years, right? Both on the municipal as well as on the national level. And here you can see the number of years. And here is the difference in overweight from the starting point. And you can see after 1 year, there's no difference, right? After 2 years, there's also no statistical difference. This is what statisticians will tell the mayor. It's still not working. After 3 years, they are almost identical. After 4 years, you see sort of a gradual shift. And after 6 years, you actually do see an effect. But it means that you have to persist over time, that the effects will only appear after a long period of time. And that the lack of effect in the first year should not discourage you from stopping. Because this is what happened almost in any interventions, especially if there are involving politicians. If you don't see an effect after 3 years, and I've seen many of these debates also in municipal areas, they say, we stop it, right? There's still no difference between our obesity rates and other obesity rates in other sectors. It just costs a lot of money and a lot of effort. So very importantly, you have to scale and you have to persevere. And the long-term effects will be there over time. So the Amsterdam approach was a pretty simple implementation of this ecological, socio-ecological model of how behavior is affected. And you can see here at the core are the families. We have two special things, I think, that are important. The first is the first 1,000 days after conception approach, with the rationale that actually overweight starts early, right? It starts after conception, during pregnancy, first 2 years of life. You have epigenetics, metabolic programming, you have the microbiome, you have all of these things happening. Taste preferences are occurring. And when you are missing this period, then you are fighting an uphill battle afterwards to correct it. And also that we have a lot of children who are already struggling with overweight or obesity, and they need special care, individual care. But also you see that we have schools, we have professionals, we have community approaches, neighborhood approaches, and you see that all of these kind of sectors in the green area are part of this collaboration. And importantly is that when we started in Amsterdam, we convinced the mayor and aldermen, who particularly were leading also in this whole field, that they needed to take a long-term approach. So in 2012, they said in 2032, we will evaluate the outcome of this program. Of course, there's intermediate evaluations. I will tell you a little bit about it, of course, today. But this long-term approach is very necessary, with the understanding that it takes a generation at least to have an effect on long-term behavior and health, growth and development and things like that. So this is a very old slide. This was in 2012 or 2013. And you can see here, it looks very mundane and very self-evident maybe, but at that time, I can tell you, it was a radical shift from changing the perspective on struggling with the problem of overweight and obesity. The mission was all children have a healthy weight in 2033. You have to set the bar high. It takes a long term, it takes a generation, as you see. And the vision was healthy weight is a collective responsibility. This sounds maybe self-evident to you, but that time, in every document there was overweight is an individual responsibility, right? So this was the first time anybody said it is a collective responsibility. The healthy choice is the normal choice. Everyone is needed, and it takes a village to raise a child. Amsterdam is basically a village compared to London. And also the strategy, it is about environment, right? So it is, we change, the city is not responsible for each individual behavior and choices that people make. It is to create environments. And so this mission and vision were actually very much key to the whole process. It's been evaluated throughout the time, and we did not call it research, because politicians are very sort of wary of academics going into this and telling them it doesn't work, or you need statistics, you need lots of measurements and things like that. We called it the learning approach, which helped enormously because nobody's against learning. I'll tell you a bit more about the integrated things, but particularly we also did RCTs in schools, for instance. So we had schools that had a healthy lifestyle program where attention was paid to healthy food, to more physical activity, to more mental health directed things. And this is just to show you that it led to on the long term, so you have to do this for 10 years, you do see, compared to control schools, a reduction in BMI over time. So this is not the most important outcome. I know you're all here to see BMI changes and percentages of obesity going down. We consider that as an end product of many of the other things that you could do. And actually the schools are now, there are 120 primary schools that are participating, not because they care so much about overweight and obesity, because they have so many other problems, but because these programs showed there was increased and improved school performance, there was a reduction in bullying, the social structure in the school improved also by having more attention, and the mental health of the children improved as well. So obesity was not the main target that they were interested in, but they had all these wonderful core ideas that schools are responsible for, like school performance and school grades and things like that, that they are happy, they don't want to go back. And this, I think, is the key to success, is you have to change into environments where people feel comfortable, they think it is helpful to their key objectives. Schools are not there to reduce obesity, but they are there to learn and to teach children, right? And if that's going well, then of course you should keep doing it. So over time, we shifted from a quite simple linear model to a much more dynamic systems approach. And I know in the UK this is done in many places also. We do this systems approach, but we also increased participation of the people who are living in the neighborhood and working in a neighborhood, teaching in a neighborhood, and things like that. So we do social network analysis, very important. We do all these causal loop diagrams and frameworks, and we have all of these kind of things. But the participative action research is a very, very much core element of this, because we realize that all these interventions were usually done top-down. You know, the government wants to change the food environment and the way you choose your foods and drinks, and etc. They want to determine what your child eats at school, and that is always met with resistance. So actually we have groups of people that we involve in the development of interventions. I will give you two short examples. One was, well, in 10 to 14-year-olds. Why 10 to 14-year-olds? That's 10-year-olds are still in primary school, 14-year-olds are in secondary school, and from the transition from primary to secondary schools, a lot of things happens in the lives of children. Physical activity goes down, obesity rates goes up, eating habits change gradually or radically, actually. And so we follow children from 10 to 14 years, and we did this in a participatory way. This is very sort of, I wasn't trained to do this, let's put it that way. I was an interventionist, experiments, epidemiology, these kind of things. And participative action research is difficult to get funded because, for instance, the first year you spend to build trust. So what's the outcome of 1 year of funded research is you have built a trusted relationship. Well, nobody is very much impressed to that. How do you measure that? How do you get to people to continue supporting that kind of thing? But we did this, and you can see we did a 6-year course with 10 to 14-year-olds who were then, of course, already 60. And they formulated with us, without any sort of clear guidance into a particular direction, 63 action by 12 action groups, and 22 of these actions were implemented. So we asked children, actually, can you photograph your food environment? Where are you seduced to unhealthy food choices? Where is it you would see improvement? What would you like to see as a change in your home environment, in your school environment, in your environment where in the neighborhood and things like that? And they come with suggestions. They talk to each other. They talk to parents. And you get an idea which is usually much more radical than we as researchers dare to propose to politicians, because they will simply say, if you seduce us to unhealthy food options, we will do it. So if you want us to stop it, take them away, right? So they are much more radical. But once they have expressed it, and they also formulate it in that way in concrete actions and implementation of that action, it is actually their idea, right? It's not the idea of the government. It's not the idea of academics that are looking upon you and saying you're living your life in the wrong way. You should do other things. This is how they would like it to change. So we do a lot of this system dynamics, but the participatory part is very important because the interventions that we had then, for instance, in schools, they last because it was not a program or a project. It is something that was thought of and developed and implemented by the children themselves. This is another one where we did it with participatory action research with Turkish mothers of young children, so first year of life, basically. And also here, we aim to get this healthier start of life. And I'm not going to go into details, but this is the participatory action process is you make people to think about how would it be, what kind of things, actions they would prefer. And if you bring this to the local stakeholders, the housing establishment, the food sector, the food environment and things like that, they will actually listen because they are their customers. It's not somebody from the local municipality that's telling them that they have to change what they sell. Very importantly also, and I have only a very brief amount of time, so long-term participatory action, scaling is important, getting everybody involved, all the stakeholders for a long-term commitment in which everybody sees also a co-creation in terms of outcomes that is helpful to what they do. Transportation, schools, as I told you, town planning, these kind of things, they are all involved in this kind of process. And it takes a long-term process, right? The most difficult part is that, for instance, with these teenagers, it took 6 years to get it to full implementation. And keeping and building the trust is an important part of it. So the last years we've teamed up also because we think it's not going fast enough. We thought of creating a law-based kind of perspective. And these are some professors of law for health and life, where they actually considered the rights of children, the right to a healthy environment, the right to healthy food. This kind of rights-based perspectives are changing it, because then we also measured the food environments, and we said, and we could demonstrate 95% in some neighborhoods of all the foods that are being promoted and being sold are unhealthy. This is not a choice. This is no, you can tell this to liberals, you can tell it to any kind of political kind of thing. This is not free choice, right? This is not having your own responsibility and making different choices. There should be a balance in the environment where there is access to healthy, affordable foods. And so taking that rights kind of perspective changed the way we look at childhood marketing, at childhood environments, school lunches, these kind of things, but also playgrounds, activities that are sponsored usually by food companies. They were not allowed to be there anymore. And slowly governments, local governments particularly, use these kind of laws and perspectives now to look at the food environment, measure it, because you need to have an idea, and propose the balance. So instead of, say, banning a certain brand or a chain of fast food restaurants or something like that, we actually say there is so much room for healthy and unhealthy food providers. And if the unhealthy places are filled, there's no more room, right? You can only fill it with healthier ones. So I think that's an important thing. So the take-home message from Amsterdam was that we take a long-term perspective. Everybody is needed. We have an environmental change-based approach. And these integrated systems approaches can lead to long-term reduction of overweight and obesity. I think we sort of demonstrated this now quite a few times. But if you are only in it for a year or two or something like that, have small projects, simple, single setting projects in one age group or something like that, it doesn't really work. It needs long-term commitment of all stakeholders and has to take, I think, a participatory action strategy and a life course approach. That means starting from conception. And then national policies actually are very unreliable in our country. We've had some regulations and policies, but they've been taken away by a new government, etc. So the energy and the commitment is really much more on a local one. And I think we learned from this slowly, also by exchanging ideas with other countries like the UK. And I would like to hear your opinion and to learn more from you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I should have not taken my microphone off. Do you mind? We're going to now have a panel discussion. So sure. I think you're going to join us, and then hopefully we're going to be joined online by Dennis. Dennis, are you online?
Good morning.
Good morning. Hi. And also Nikita. Great. Let's just take our seats up here. That was really fascinating and inspiring, so thank you for sharing all the lessons. I'm sure we've all got many questions that we'll come to in due course. I just wondered, the programme's now at the halfway point, is that right?
Yes.
What's been the most sort of surprising lesson? What surprised you in doing this?
Well, I think the most surprising was that over time, people changed their perspective on this is an obesity prevention program to a healthy environment where mental health and physical health, and we had COVID also during this time. And so the immune system was improved also by healthier lifestyles and environment. Social inequality decreased. And things like this school performance and things like that, they became much more important in the view of the people than simply obesity. So it's very important to focus on things like improving health-related behaviors to prevent overweight and obesity, because it will reduce the incidence of diabetes and all these non-communicable diseases on the long term. But the quick wins for people are not there. For instance, I'll give you one example. We did this in low-income multi-ethnic communities, and the major outcome that they enjoyed most was improved oral health. So there's 40% of these children between the ages of 5 and 10 have dental erosion because they drink all these sugary drinks and sip on these soft drinks and fruit juices and things like that. And dental erosion is a very visible sign. It's considered to be very important for children. It's very expensive to, if at all possible, to restore. And so they all wanted to know, not so much how can my child lose weight, but how can I improve also the oral health? So you have to find things that are important for people and tag them along. So we then added our work with the local dentistry, the pediatric dentist, and things like that, because that was very important to people on the short term. And I think the most important lesson was you keep listening on what are the concerns of people, what are their, where is their motivation to change things, what is important for them that happens, and how it should be changed. Because, yeah, learning from them was the most educational part of it, I think.
I was going to ask my fellow panelists almost the same question. I'll bring you in on your own experiences in Lambeth and in Scotland, but what surprises you about what's happened in Amsterdam, and what's the learning you think we can most take from it?
Interesting question. I guess for me, something that I think is really admirable is the longevity point that you were saying from the outset, being really realistic that this is like a generational shift that we're trying to see, and being able to get that buy-in and still having that buy-in today. We were talking earlier about when our program first started, we were also all obsessed with Amsterdam. It was like, what's Amsterdam doing? How can we learn? And we're still here today learning from you, and that commitment is still there. And I think that is genuinely surprising when we look at kind of like, political turmoil and change, and how long-term commitments kind of can drift off sometimes. So it's really admirable.
Dennis?
Yeah, I think two things jumped out. The perseverance piece, I'm sure we'll come back to that. This is a long game. And then secondly, the right to good food and the prioritization of this way of thinking, that there is this important human rights element to this whole discussion.
Great. One thing I thought was interesting towards the end of your presentation was the idea of measuring the food environment and having a food environment score. Because one of the challenges, I think, in this debate is it can be quite sort of vague, this idea of the food environment, and it can't be tractable to policymakers, whereas as soon as you can measure something, you can start holding people to account and doing things. So can you just say a bit more about how that worked and whether you think that is a promising approach?
It is a promising approach for town planning and for new environments where you still can decide who is going to be in it and what not. If you have established businesses, it's much more difficult to shut them down, and it will create all kinds of problems. But I will tell you one thing. We have an organization, it's also active now in the UK, called Question Mark, and I'm on their board. And we evaluate supermarkets on how well they do in terms of healthy and sustainable foods and things like that. Childhood marketing, buy one, get one free, premiums, all these sort of things. And we publish it. We publish the ranking, and it's taken up by all the media. And what happens is that supermarkets who are scoring better, which is just above, what's acceptable, but still they are on top. They publish this widely, and it's very much an impetus to do more. And the supermarkets who do very poorly, they actually want to get higher on that list. So in that way, by just measuring it and monitoring it, and do this every 2 years or so, you can actually get supermarket chains to compete to get higher on the list for healthy things with a sort of objective measure and way. And I think this is true also for neighborhoods. And if you look at streets where 90% of all the food that's sold is really crappy foods and drinks that are undermining the health of your children, then there is actually quite a lot of impetus to change that balance. And we are changing the laws now that municipalities can have health in town planning as a reason why you could accept or reject certain businesses to operate.
Right. Just one other thing that I was going to ask you about was the complexity of this program. In a way, it's a whole systems change. How do you then tease out and isolate what are the mechanisms that are driving the biggest change?
Well, in this systems approach, you actually are looking for levers, right? That are you find those points that are making a change. You can never isolate the effects. I think it is like building a wall of sandbags when the flood is, the River Thames is flooding here. I'm sure you would have a wall of sandbags. Each of these individual bags won't work, right? How many you need depends on how, when it stops, when it's enough. And you can never say this bag was much more important than this one if we could have dropped that one. It is frustrating. You need to do all of it. You won't be able to pinpoint certain effectiveness because it is the combination of all of these things that make it effective. Having said that, we also did these RCTs like with schools and randomize it and do and study carefully single interventions kind of things. Usually what we find is that single interventions like getting vending machines out of the school or increasing the price of unhealthy food products, they never have any sort of measurable effect over time. It's only when you integrate them that they have, on the long term, have impact.
Got it. Great. Dennis, I want to come over to you and just tell us a little bit about, Scotland's got a policy commitment to halving childhood obesity by 2030. I wonder whether you could say more about what you're doing there, but also which of the programmes in Amsterdam you find most relevant and sort of applicable in the context you're working in?
So the Scottish initiative kicked off in 2018, and with this objective of halving obesity. At that time, the prevalence of obesity in children, at that time sitting at about a 14%. So the goal being to take that down to 7%, and that's involved, or what it's done is stimulate a range of actions, specific elements that we can point to. But I think one of the takeaways for me from Yap's piece this morning is the importance of the integration of these, pulling of a significant number of levers. So in the Scottish case, it's meant free school meals. All primary 1 to 5 children now have access to free school meals, and we're seeing uptake rise now up to towards 70%. Primary 6 and 7, so the eldest primary school kids are going to have availability for free school meals coming this year, although with some element of means testing there. I think that early intervention piece, the importance of the die being cast in the first couple of years is recognised, and so we have something called the Best Start Food grants provided to pregnant women and families with younger children under the age of 3. And from last year, the income threshold was removed, extending the eligibility to another 20,000 women and families. And then just thinking about the environment, so the obesogenic environment that children are living in, and how to think about adapting that. And good to see that the thinking is somewhat similar in Amsterdam. So we've been thinking about restricting the advertising of high-fat, salt, sugar foods. And the delivery plan that was set out in 2018 was really challenging the government itself to start to use some of the powers that it has to control those environments. But I think to Yap's last slide about the challenge of policy implementation and the potential of dilution, this is a very good example, because so far we haven't seen action on that. I think one other area, just in terms of changing the environment where there is progress happening, and that's around restricting price and location promotion, both in retail premises and online. And I think we're going to see some regulatory plans for that set out in the coming months. And I think one thing that has come through this specific project on childhood obesity is a greater sense of determination to tackle this at the systemic level, which I guess we'll probably come back to a bit further. But the Good Food Nation framework is really, I think, taking us into that next stage of this process.
Thanks, Dennis. Nikita, sort of same question to you, really, which is in Lambeth and Southwark, where you've been working with impacts on urban health. Just give us a portrait of what you've been trying in there, and how similar is it or different is it to what we've heard from Yap?
Yeah, sure. So for context, in case people don't know who we are, Impacts on Urban Health are part of Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation, which is one of the largest health foundations in the UK. And we are place-based in the sense that we focus on 2 boroughs in South London, which are Lambeth and Southwark. And we have a mission to really be tackling health inequity within those boroughs, but we share what we learn to have an impact on other urban areas, and we also look to make changes that are outside of those boroughs if they're going to create change for people in Lambeth and Southwark. And the Children's Health and Food Programme is our longest standing programme. And I guess, so our perspective is quite different from that of Yap's and Dennis's, in the sense that, like, we aren't a key responsible figure in our kind of like areas or in our countries. We're kind of trying to come at it from different angles to influence the different levers of change. And so the things that are similar are a kind of like big focus on food environments and the places where children spend their time and shifting what's available there. We're like laser focus on inequity, so recognising that families living on low incomes are those that are being flooded by the cheap, unhealthy food and are most impacted by health inequities. And in our boroughs in particular, we know that poverty and racism intersect, which means that those from Black and racially minoritized backgrounds have additional barriers when it comes to accessing healthy, affordable food. So there's definitely lots of similarities. I guess what's been different for us is that we started off with this inspiration from Amsterdam, whole systems approach. What can we do on kind of early intervention, on physical activity, thinking about the environment as a whole. And we actually, a few years in, made the decision to just focus on food because of the kind of outsized role that played, and also recognising where, big corporate interests were really playing a big role in what families were able to access locally, and feeling like we had a unique position to try and catalyse some change on that. So, and even food is very complex and broad. So I can only empathise with that need for multiple levers of change and multiple sandbags. That's on one issue, let alone thinking about all the different kind of intersecting things that affect healthy weight.
That's a very important point you are making. For instance, with in terms of childhood obesity, 15 years ago, this was a medical treatment program, right? Children would go to hospitals, they would get physical exercise prescriptions and dietary advice and all these kind of things. That has shifted towards a much more social kind of dimension. So we realized that most people don't have time, they don't have money, they don't have skills, they don't have knowledge, they don't have opportunities. They live in a physical or cultural environment where healthy choices are very difficult. So the advice of doctors and dietitians and physiotherapists are almost impossible to implement. So much of this is now related to functioning of families and to give parenting support, give financial support if needed, there's lots of problems in the environment that will preclude people from making different choices because they have other things on their mind, right? And so I think what has also happened is that we shifted much more to from behavior, which is in this rainbow kind of thing is the essence, but to much more social, environmental, upstream determinants of health.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult because you can't really address it and do RCTs in it and things like that. But it is an integrated part of it.
Great. Nikita, can I just pick up on what's worked in Lambeth and Southwark and what hasn't, or you're less sure about?
I think one of the things that felt like a real turning point was originally we were really focused on closing the inequality gap in our boroughs, and we thought that meant just focusing in on those neighbourhoods that were more deprived, really flooded with unhealthy food options, and thinking about how do we get everyone looking at this from the same angle and collaborating together to shift that neighbourhood. And what we learned is that the levers for change are not necessarily all within that neighbourhood. In fact, the biggest driving factors might be, the fact that the national threshold for free school meals is woefully low, or actually there's 7 out of the 10 biggest food companies that are making most of their profits from unhealthy food. And, we might have an ambition to be shifting what's in convenience stores, but actually what wholesalers are doing when it comes to encouraging and supporting convenience stores to stock healthier items, those are the really influential bits of the system that we needed to be collaborating with. And so that has taken us on a journey of, in all our portfolios, whether it's looking at the streets, the earlier settings or the schools that children are in, all our portfolios have an element of influencing national and /international industry or policy, and what are the local levers that we can be enabling, whether that's more community-led food provision on streets, or whether that's local authority levers to change schools. So I guess I think it's been a sharpening of our understanding of where change is most meaningful.
So I'd love to sort of pick up on that with all of you, really, which is, to what extent should we be placing the emphasis on place-based programmes and replicating Amsterdam in different cities and places, or is this fundamentally about national change? So you could argue, if we regulate or tax sugar and salt, or regulate the supermarkets in a different way, that's the main way in which we can affect change, whereas even if we souped up the powers of local authorities and mayors, it's always going to be relatively limited if you just approach it through a sort of local lens. But would you agree with that?
Well, I have not given up on national policies, but they are weak. They are usually watered down by all kinds of interests. There's very little integrated thinking in national policies. Locally, it's much easier to do it. I will tell you, one of the biggest successes we had was in a town called Zwolle. We did a 10-year evaluation. I had a PhD student going to all of the settings where we did things and we started things. And we asked, what is still operating and what stopped, and why is it still there? And to our amazement, they said, no, it was not your program. We always did it like this. So the way we started it became part of routine way of working. And connecting things like what happens in schools, what happens in neighborhoods. Nationally, it's very difficult. You can have supportive things like taxation of foods, like a sugary beverage drink tax as you have here. It will have a small effect maybe on some purchasing behavior, but to really change the drinking habits, I will give you an example. We did with low-income mothers, we did a water carafe engraving course. 50 women participated in that, and that they had the symbols engraved in it, and from that day on, that water carafe was the central piece in their living room, right? It had the children's names, and it had important symbolic effects, and in that carafe was always water. And just by changing that, without telling anything about sugar and dental health or body weight or whatever, these kids changed sugary drinks to water, because mother said, you drink my water from my carafe, right? So it becomes, you have to somehow change things. We also had interventions that were aimed at changing price, but then there is inflation, and there is all these, all of these things that are happening anyway. And the impact of that to really change behavior on the long term, what we find is we just completed a study on teenagers, and we changed the price of the soft drinks. They first go from the A brands to the home brands of the supermarket. Then they find some cheaper alternative. They find, they find a way to get their sugary beverages anyway. I think the value is the connectiveness of people on the local level, which you won't see on the national level. The persistence of that, while people realize, and especially if you do the participative action kind of thing, they own it. It's their program. It's not something that can change just by the new election. Somebody else comes in and they scrap all the taxations, or they change the rules or whatever. This is what they own, and this is why it's much more on a long term successful, I think. That's what we learned. The things that are, after 10, 14 years, are still operating are the things that are taken over by the people themselves, by the schools, because they like it so much that, the bullying goes down in the schools and things like that, as a side effect of having more time for physical activity and relaxation and healthy eating. I think that those kind of wins, for local stakeholders, is much more important than a tax on a national level.
Dennis, wondered whether you agreed with that, and the degree of emphasis to place on national measures versus local measures, and also pick up on the point that Yap also mentioned about how you avoid industry capture and the watering down of apparently ambitious policies.
So I'm going to disagree, actually. Just in terms of the negative view of what can be done at the national level.
It's just my experience.
We're getting a high degree of feedback here. I'm not sure if you're hearing me clearly.
We're hearing you fine, so apologies if it's on our end.
Okay. So what we're seeing is a degree of unanimity amongst political leadership in Scotland for the need to act and change things at both national and local levels. So I think it's got to be a combination of the two.
Sure.
And I think that that degree of political consensus is unusual. I think it points to the nature and the extreme nature of the challenge that we face in Scotland. And so our objective is to set out to transform the food system in Scotland. And that cannot only be done by national governmental moves. Neither can it only be done by grassroots activities. It's got to be that combination of the two. And I think one practical example of that is our national planning framework. So a huge piece of work on spatial planning for the future of the country. That has recently completed over in the last couple of years and is now the framework within which all spatial decision making about almost everything in Scotland happens, both on land and now at sea, where there's much activity happening. And so when you start to think about the relevance of that to local authorities and the planning decisions that they can make, and the need for this kind of food scoring of what makes a good local food environment, then the interaction between National Planning Framework 4, as it's called, and the ambitions of those local authorities to improve their environment is really relevant. I'm sure the whole question of dilution and capture will be part of this story over the coming years and decades. And this is absolutely a long-term project that Scotland has embarked on. And I think learning how to face into the realities of the power differentials that do exist. How does a small nation engage with global corporations with vast influence and impact is a really important question. And going into this with our eyes open, I think is a critical part of that process. But we begin with cross-party unanimity in terms of support for this legislation. It's not seen as a narrow political priority of one particular party or one part of the political spectrum. The challenges as such that I think the Scottish political leadership has said, this we need to do, and we need to do together.
Great. We're going to sort of come to questions from the floor in a second. Just one final one from me, which is at Nesta, we're thinking about trying to get a place-based experiment off the ground. And I would say that so far we've thought about this more in terms of how you can take a given place and test out things that ultimately you want to do nationally. So, for instance, get all the supermarket chains and others to shift their behaviour, but use that as a proving ground for why regulation is feasible and will not cause a backlash. I think we're also interested in it from a sort of momentum building perspective, because the more we can have local places and mayors taking this on, I think it's easier for national politicians to do this. But I think what's interesting through this conversation has been the things that only localities can do through the planning system, for instance, or scoring the local food environment or working with schools. But I just wondered whether you've got any advice from having done this and got the scars on your back from the successes and the failures. Have you got any advice on if you were doing this again or doing it in the UK, what would you do?
Well, I think there's a lot of value in having demonstration projects, because there's a lot of, I agree totally with the food systems, but there's so many polarized views on how to do it and what kind of interests are there. It's usually very helpful to see that things work and they improve. Like we did only in one school where we showed that there's improved school performance, and then all the schools wanted it, right? So it is to demonstrate that you can actually actively work together in a smaller community, and that you make things happen and you monitor the beneficial changes, and you have the people who live there tell about it, that this is what we did and this is what happened, and these are the benefits that we had. It is very inspirational for other communities to do it also. But scaling is not just copying. There's no blueprint for one neighborhood in my view. In smaller towns or bigger cities with neighborhoods that have completely different ethnic and socio-cultural things, you have to do different things, and you have still to use the local wisdom of the people there to make that change. So I think if you skip that kind of thing and say it worked there, so we're now going to implement it everywhere without having people on board, making that change happening and adapting it to the local community. I think I think it's a cliche, but adopt, adapt, and adapt, right? That's just the kind of thing you should do. and change it to local circumstances.
Great, thank you. Akisa.
I definitely agree that kind of looking at gaps in where we've got evidence, looking at a local level and trying to see how you can build what works and then using that to make the case of what's possible can be really effective. We've done that with working with supermarkets and manufacturers to do trials of what you can do within store to increase purchasing of healthier items. And actually it can act as like an example of why more like ambition from national policy is needed, because often these small-scale kind of short-term trials don't create the shift. So I do think it can really work. It would be great to think about what areas, such as, for example, out of home, or areas where there's less developed kind of action behind kind of policy asks. I guess the one thing that comes up when I think about lots of different things popping up in different areas to kind of demonstrate what's happening and create change is the potential risk for inequity, and also the potential unintended consequence with some policy areas of showing national government that they don't need to do anything because local areas will take action. So free school meals, extending eligibility is a good example of that. Like, at what point does it become a tipping point that government sees it as too much inequity that they have to take action versus what great local kind of energy and innovation. So spotting for that unintended consequence feels important.
Great, thank you. Dennis, final word?
Yeah, I think that two examples that come to my mind of the benefit of this kind of experimentation, which is bound to be a really important part of the evolution of this whole project of food system transformation, and both actually coming from the third sector. One, a opportunity to go out and test the concept of public diners. So this is a Back to the Future idea, something that Britain had coming through the 1940s on into the 50s, places where good quality food was served with some degree of support or subsidy if required. And the proposition is to trial several of these, particularly in areas where the food choice is really poor. And so let's see how that goes on. Second one, around peri-urban farming. So one of Scotland's cities, some really interesting work going on to see what kind of farming system would we need around the boundaries of the city to really begin to change move the needle in terms of the amount of local quality food, fresh food being produced to feed that city, or begin to reverse the imbalance, the picture of large proportion of food being imported compared to where we were in previous times. So these are experimentation activities that really should be encouraged and supported.
Great, thank you, Dennis. I'm going to hand over to Clara now, who actually leads our work on sort of location-based testing, to pick up the kind of Q&A. Just final thought was, you mentioned public diners, Dennis. We do have a little playful series called Signals, which are trying to stargaze into the future. And we did talk in our most recent one about public diners, so do check that out. Another couple of things worth flagging. One is the blueprint for tackling obesity. This is a massive piece of work over the last 2 years, which has involved working with an expert academic panel to try and review about 3,000 papers evaluating what works in this space, and critically trying to say, how good is the evidence, how much does it cost, and what is the impact on obesity? And in each of those 30 policies we spotlight, we've tried to sort of estimate the effect on obesity. So do check that out on our website. And the other thing is, just last week, I wrote something on a Substack called Policy Fix that tries to synthesize some of our thinking on obesity in a fairly accessible form, including some of the policy recommendations we've got. So do check those things out. Clara, over to you.
Great, thank you. Is my mic working? Yes. Wonderful. Ravi, thank you so much. I'm going to chair our questions from the audience. So over to you guys. And I know we've also had some questions coming in online as well. Great. I saw a hand go up, lady in blue.
Thank you. But also I was really interested in the child rights point that you mentioned, Yap. And I'm especially interested in picking this up with Dennis because Scotland has UNCRC incorporated in Scotland. Unfortunately, we don't have it in England. And I'm interested to know if that has been powerful in Amsterdam in shifting the narrative a little bit to actually bring it back to babies and children and thinking about their rights and from the beginning and how that has been used as a lever within the wider work you're doing in Amsterdam. And from Dennis, in terms of Scotland, is that something that might be considered as part of the UNCRC work?
Yes, to say a little bit about that children's rights perspective, it was framed in that sense that these lawyers threatened to actually sue the government because they were negligent in their fundamental obligation to provide healthy environments for children, because it is a children's right. So there's childhood marketing, there is all kinds of unhealthy foods and drinks marketing to young children. And the reason why commercial entities could exploit the health of your children for financial gain is one of these very powerful issues to really discuss. Because in our constitution, the government is responsible for healthy environments, right? So clean air, safe drinking water, healthy food environments, safety, and all these kind of things. So instead of saying it is these companies that are seducing your children to unhealthy behaviors, we said, no, it's the government's failure to protect. So health protection is a fundamental issue, and it changed the narrative in saying we should attack and sue the companies to now we sue the government for negligence. This has been done in climate change also, and it is successfully. And so now these kind of lawsuits they never got off the ground, but just the threat of it made governments aware that actually trying to get away from nanny state kind of activities, they were actually neglecting their duties, their responsibilities. So it did help to change the narrative.
Dennis, did you?
Yeah, and I think the same too in Scotland, in the sense of as this primary piece of legislation was being developed, it formed a really important part of the discussion. And I think for quite a lot of people, particularly people in the food industry, this was a new topic to consider. But it has been embedded into the Act, the importance and the right to everybody in Scotland to enjoy good food. So I think the practicalities, where we're going to see the opportunities for it to be worked out, there's a requirement on every local authority and every regional health board to produce a good food plan. And that's a fundamental part of the mechanism of how we actually begin to transform the food system in Scotland. And thinking about the health boards and the opportunity for thinking around the improvement of the experience of young children from birth, those early first 3 years, the opportunities for these health board plans to have a focus on that age group, coming at it through the prism of the right, the human right to good food, I think will be important.
Thank you, Dennis. Nikita, did you want to add anything?
I think just interesting to see in the States that there's been the first lawsuit against Big Food at the end of last year, which is obviously the first of its kind, trying to use strategic litigation to move the issue in another country. So just watching with interest, not that it's something that will necessarily happen here, but what we can learn from other movements that aren't represented today.
Great, thank you. If you could just say your name and where you're from as well, that would be great.
Thanks very much, Teresa Marto, University of Cambridge. Thanks to all speakers and hearing about your experiences. And it clearly is national and local. And while evidence is still uncertain, we've never had so much evidence. And I would thoroughly recommend anyone who hasn't seen it to look at the Nesta blueprint, which I think is a prototype for how all evidence-based policymaking should be framed. My question to all of you is whether we're missing a trick here for legally binding ambitions. So in Scotland, a fantastic ambition to halve childhood obesity from 14 to 7%. We had the same in the UK, and unfortunately, in both countries, in England, unfortunately in both countries, rates are going up. So we've got climate laws now in at least, I think, 60 countries, which have national, legally binding targets, and certainly in the UK, also built into the legislation is the importance of having, first of all, credible policies that are going to achieve the ambition, and an independent committee that's going to set sub-goals as well as mark the homework of governments. To what extent do you think we should get smarter about health, and in particular obesity, and borrow something from climate laws? Thanks very much.
I'm happy to go first. I love the ambition. I definitely feel like putting the same gravity and weight on an issue like health and obesity and the inequalities that are implicit in that feels really important. I guess one comparison that I know from some of our other work on air pollution is that you can have legally binding limits that are consistently missed, and there's often still lack of action, and if there's not the kind of like collaboration, resources, political will, like you won't be meeting them anyway, so it can only ever be part of the picture. But I completely agree that, like, what would that do to kind of place a new emphasis of the importance of this issue is definitely like an interesting reflection.
Great. Yeah, Dennis, would either of you like to come in on that?
Yes, the lawyers that I talked to you about that give this child health rights perspective are also working on climate change. So they are inspiring, and they are working together also to see how you. Actually, these lawsuits are suing the government as well as companies. Like they had very successful lawsuits against Shell and the government not achieving the climate goals that were written in the. They were very concrete. And we don't have that kind of roles yet, but we do have ambition in the Netherlands, for instance. We also have a national program in which halving childhood obesity is the goal in 2040 or something like that, and steps along the way. And that's being monitored, and there is a point in which no progress is being a ground for concern, I think, and for litigation, if possible. The difficulty is, however, you need so many people to change that, to reach the objectives. Say this whole systems kind of approach makes it very difficult to make one responsible for the failure, right? So it is the integrated part that makes it happen, and you cannot sue the different parts of it. So it is quite difficult to do. To sue individual companies, it's been done many times before in the US, I think, and they failed always because it's not one single company that you can blame for obesity, right? So it is. Yes, the minister in charge. Yes, so I think it's more useful to sue the governments, and this is what we have tried to do also in terms of with childhood marketing. If they allow to, because the discussion is it's the responsibility of individuals, parents, etc. And if they buy unhealthy stuff for their children, then it's their responsibility, right? So we have to change that narrative in terms that there are companies that are undermining the responsibility of parents to do so. But it is not easy to pinpoint. it is the fault of the government that people make unhealthy choices, for instance. But it is a good idea we have the Paris Climate Agreement as the sounding board of all of these policies, I think, in Europe. And they were part of that lawsuit that was against the government, and they had to pay enormous sums of money to repair that and to also to change and meet those objectives, if not met.
Thank you. Yeah, Dennis,
Sorry.
did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just quickly, I think, Teresa, it's a useful observation. I think what we see in Scotland is that the climate legislation, climate policy is beginning to see change, significant measurable change in terms of how food is being produced, the impact in terms of reduced carbon and also biodiversity improvement. And the idea of looking at those mechanisms and seeing how transferable some of those approaches are to the other end of the food system is a really important question. And the Scottish Food Commission has this role of being independent of government to challenge government as to its ambition and the pace of progress towards the outcomes set out in the Good Food Nation Act. So this entity having that degree of independence is really crucial. And I think if we do our job well, it will require a government to be more ambitious in terms of its legislative priorities, in particular with regard to the management, the availability, the control of food products that are clearly causing significant ill health to the population. So I think we've got a mechanism, and we can take learnings from the climate domain into food regulation in the future.
Thank you, Dennis. Let's go over to our online community for a question.
Yeah, we have a question from Candice Bryan, who asks, given Amsterdam's diverse population, how did you ensure that your approaches are culturally sensitive and respectful of varying faith-based dietary practices? And how did you address barriers arising from these considerations in the promotion of healthy lifestyle changes?
Yes, that's a very good point. Of course, in every this is why we do a neighborhood approach, right? We include the local leaders, different ethnic minorities, and all the citizens that are living in a particular neighborhood, which will be different. And we ask them what are acceptable changes for you to make. So there's a strong impetus. We have neighborhoods where the majority is from African descent. There we have local leaders that help us to reach with the community and come to acceptable kind of policies and changes. And basically, it's changing the environment so people can make the choices that they really wanted to make themselves. So it is. We have 175 ethnicities, I think, in Amsterdam. We do include all of them in our deliberations and policy development.
Great, thank you. And Nikita, this is something that Impact on Urban Health have done a lot of as well in terms of the work in Lambeth and Southwark. So what would you say in terms of working with communities and bringing out lived experience? What would you say are the important things to consider?
I think it's about considering it within every aspect of what you do. So you may have more universal policies that are going to shift an entire environment. How are those designed and co-produced with the diversity of people that they're going to affect? But then there's also what are you doing in addition that is really speaking to inequity and putting the power in the hands of those communities. So for example, we have the Black Food Fund that we set up locally, which is a kind of panel of Black-led organisations where we've devolved funding to that group. And over the course of the next 3 years, they will be making kind of funding decisions that they have the power designed for them. So I think it's the kind of complementary approach, and I would agree with you that it's more the process that you take than the nature of how diverse those communities are, like those principles still stay the same, I think.
And Dennis, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think all I would say that our first of the 6 outcomes set out for how do we measure a good when it comes to transformation of the Scottish food system speaks to the availability of culturally appropriate food for all. And I think that's recognizing that we have to really be mindful of the diversity of communities making up population of Scotland, and so this activity must this whole project must be bearing that in mind. This has to be a diverse and relevant and sensitive across society.
Great. Well, Dennis, we are at time, and I think that's a great note to end on. So I want to say thank you very much to my Nesta colleagues who arranged the event, particularly Ravi, our chair, and also Derry, who instigated the event and did the lion's share of the work. And of course, our 3 speakers, Nikita, Yap, and Dennis. And thank you to all of you for coming along and making it such an engaging and exciting morning. And we look forward to being in touch. So if you are interested in our blueprint work, please get in touch and have a chat with us. We have lots of information online about our various projects and the sort of work that we do at Nesta. We do hold other events and other webinars that cover similar topics. And so please do sign up to our newsletter and stay in touch. And it's been a pleasure to see you all here today.